Hi, this is George Graybill again, telling my story of the year and a half I spent in the early 70s traveling around the world on almost no money. Um, this is chapter 20. It's about a story about a trek up the Kali Gandaki gorge before there was a road or bridges or airports or pizza up there. So chapter 20. Hashish, Yaks and Spies. I met Jim and Elsa in the ticket line at the train station. They were from London, and they were also headed to Kathmandu. The train ride through the night was uneventful, and the next day we did the paperwork at the border and boarded the bus for the Nepalese capital. The highway soon became frightening. There were endless switchbacks in the narrow road with long drop-offs to the switchback below. At one point, we passed a truck lying just off the pavement that had evidently rolled down from a higher point. The truck was upside down and surrounded by 3 dead bodies. As usual, we went to a hotel restaurant someone had recommended. Jim and Elsa lucked out and got the room over the kitchen. It was the best room because it was January and none of the rooms were heated. This room was always kept nice and warm by heat rising from below. At some point, we met Gladys from Baltimore, who had just finished her stint in the Peace Corps. I think it was the next morning. I came down to the restaurant. I ran into the 2 Australians I had tripped with in the Darwin Botanical Gardens months ago. I'm not sure what to include in my description of Nepal in 1971. Everyone and his uncle have been trekking in Nepal by now, and they won't stop talking about it. I think I will try to only describe the ways in which the country was different then, and only mention the most spectacular things that haven't changed. And a number of things were very different then. To begin with, marijuana was legal in all its forms. For this reason, it was the most common destination for people traveling the hippie trail. There were also people who came just to track. The hashish candy was my favorite. There were also restaurants that catered to those who indulged. Everyone had told us to go to the cabin restaurant, so we did. In 1973, the Nepalese government outlawed the sale of marijuana products. The city looked much different then. There were almost no Western touches. The architecture all looked like it belonged there. Now there are fast food chain restaurants. Little girls wore adult jewelry and makeup. They looked cute if you could stop thinking about pedophiles. There were also orphan children without makeup in the streets. They looked happy and well fed. In the afternoon, I often saw them sprawled on the sidewalk doing school homework. At the post office, there was a package for me from Linda. She had sent me a book by Chogyam Trungpa as a gift. There was also a letter saying that she would like to come to India to see me. I felt excited and nervous. I'll skip the sightseeing. I visited museums, stupas, parks, and bought a colorful brocade jacket. I still wear it sometimes, hoping someone will say, "Nice jacket, where did you get it?" Jim, Elsa, Gladys, and I decided to go trekking. I went to the tourism office to get a trekking permit. In those days, they were easy to get and inexpensive. When I came out of the office, I noticed 2 shop owners sitting at a small table on the sidewalk playing chess. The odd thing was they were laughing, talking, and slamming the pieces down. They acted like kids playing Go Fish. It was obvious that they did not think of themselves as elite intellectuals as some Western chess players do. It was just a game. We flew from Kathmandu to Pokhara in an old DC-3. The runway at Pokhara was a meadow. We learned that 10 minutes before the plane landed, a siren blared to warn people to get their livestock out of the way. The terminal was a 10 by 10 foot concrete block building with a spring scale hanging from the eaves. We all had mixed feelings about hiring a porter, but in the end we decided we would. On the way out of town, we stopped at a Tibetan refugee camp, which we heard was a good place to find porters. The people in the camp had been made refugees by the Chinese communist crackdown in Tibet. This was the same unpleasantness that sent the Dalai Lama our way. The Tibetans there seemed to be doing fine. In addition to hiring out as porters, they were producing some high-quality handicrafts. We hired a man named Punsak, added some of our things to his pack, and hit the trail. Punsak used a classic Nepalese porter's pack, which looked painful. It consisted of a large wicker basket, very narrow shoulder straps, and a forehead strap. I think he carried about 70 pounds. And each of our packs probably averaged half that. The plan was to trek west to the Kali Gandaki River, then follow the river gorge north to the town of Jomsom. In 1971, that was as close to Tibet as trekkers were allowed to go. The only thing I remember from those first days were the views of Machu Picchu. It's supposed to look like the Matterhorn. It stands boldly alone out in front of the Annapurna Range. The route went over a 10,000-foot pass before descending to the Kali Gandaki. The beginning of the approach to the pass was the dreaded Steppes of Golna. I may have the name wrong. As best I can remember, the elevation gain was 2,000 feet and the steps were steep and high. Porters did not like them. At the merciful top was a small village. As I topped the last step, I saw a woman sitting on the ground weaving. After a night at an inn at the top of the pass, we descended to the gorge. We crossed the gorge on a swinging footbridge that I once saw listed as one of the 10 most frightening bridges in the world. On the other side was the village of Tatopani. Tatopani means hot water, and it is so named because there's a hot spring. We found the village inn and went to the hot spring. When we got there, we saw the muddy hole occupied by 3 naked local women. They popped out and motioned for us to get in. As we took off our clothes, they pointed and giggled. The temperature was just right. The women stood around talking for a while and then left. Today you can drive to Tatopani across a substantial bridge. The hot spring is an enlarged cemented pool full of Japanese tourists, and you can buy pizza in the village. We stayed for 2 days to rest up, and then went up the gorge to the next village named Dana. In Dana, there were citrus trees with fruit on them. We were not at a very high elevation yet, nor very far north. I think it was between Dana and the next village, Leyte, that we got the German Shepherd. He just started following us and never left. He always wanted to help out by leading the way. Whenever there was a fork in the trail, however, he always chose the wrong direction. He chased monkeys and was terrified of cows and yaks. In Leyte, the owners of the inn butchered a sheep, and we bought the liver for the dog. The Nepalese were dumbfounded. One day, I sat down with the dog and looked him in the eye and said, "Shake." He raised his paw. We never came up with a plausible explanation as to how a dog that understood English ended up in a remote part of Nepal. All the villages were attractive and the architecture was interesting. Many of the houses were made of stone with no mortar and had slate roofs. Most had 2 stories. At the entrance to a village, there was always a stone bench, and behind the bench was a low wall. The wall was just the right height to rest a backpack on if you were if it were the kind of pack that Punsak was carrying. The villages were about 10 miles apart. Um, the, the villages were about 10 miles apart, which was convenient for us. Halfway between the villages, there was usually a stone hut for travelers who get caught in a storm. The two towns that the hut was between had helped build the hut, and each town planted a tree on either side of the hut. The trail was almost always good. It had to be because everyone and their livestock and pack animals had to move on this trail. Some herders moved up and down the trail with the seasons. There were sections of the trail that had been cut into vertical stone cliffs, I assume with hand tools. The people who built these sections had made the trail wide enough for 2 burros to pass and left a low guardrail on the outside. The trail was almost always good. It had to be because everyone and their livestock and pack animals had to move on the trail. Some herders moved up and down the trail with the seasons. There were sections of the trail that had been cut into vertical stone cliffs, I assume with hand tools. The people who built these sections had made the trail wide enough for 2 burros to pass and left a low guardrail on the outside. We often passed piles of mani stones. These were flat stones on which Tibetan letters for the Buddhist mantra Om Mani Padme Hum had been carved, not once, but over and over. We had left the Hindu Nepalese behind by now and were among Buddhists who were ethnically Tibetan. I shouldn't stereotype ethnic groups, but we all felt that the Tibetans were usually warm and friendly. Punsak certainly was. Almost everyone we passed on the trail was walking. A few men were on horseback, but I had the feeling that horses were more of a status symbol than practical transportation. As often or as not, the man was walking and leading the horse. A Tibetan monk bowed and said namaste as he passed, as everyone did. I looked back at him and saw that his hair was dragging on the ground. We passed pack trains of brightly decorated burros and herders moving their stock south. We passed an unkempt hippie-like man in shackles being led out by an official. My guess was that he had been trying to live out some sort of spiritual fantasy. You need a permit for that. We saw a frail old woman on her way to the hospital. She was sitting on a chair strapped to a porter's back. There's now a highway along our entire trekking route. It's hard to imagine how much that has changed the lives of the people living in this remote area. We were now, Jim and Elsa were not much into pot, and I got the feeling that they missed their neighborhood pub. In Leyte, there was a small, sparsely stocked store in which I noticed 2 cans of beer. They had probably been left behind by a climbing expedition. I bought them and dropped them into my backpack. We set off for Tukche, the next village. We were gaining altitude, and there was one long, exhausting climb around midday. At the top, we dropped our packs to rest, and I said, "Beer would be good about now, right, Jim?" Oh, I say it most certainly would. Here, have one of mine. We were now between Dhaulagiri and Annapurna. Both are well over 26,000 feet, and we were at 3,000 or 4,000 feet. I remember being impressed by a difference of 5,000 feet the first time I saw the Rockies. A difference of 23,000 feet is almost hard to believe when you see it, and impossible to photograph. After Tukche, we hiked to our last overnight stop, the village of Marfa. It was cooler and drier now as we approached 10,000 feet. The countryside had less vegetation and looked bleaker. At dusk, I left the inn to take a stroll around town before dinner. It was similar to the other villages, well built, with well-built stone houses on either side of a narrow flagstone main street. I passed a long row of prayer wheels. I met a group of happy, dirty children. Baths are rare when firewood is scarce. I heard a loud beating noise and looked down the street to the outskirts of town where a helicopter had just landed. I went back to the inn for dinner. As always, we sat on the floor by the fire and ate dinner with the family that owned the inn. It was usually potatoes with a sprinkling of some unknown greens and barley mush called tsampa. We were all digging in when two large men walked in. They were muscular but overweight and had brush cuts and Texas accents. I asked one of them who they were. He said they were with Air America. I asked where they had been, and they said Muktanat. This is a pilgrimage site, but it is off limits to all but card-carrying pilgrims. I said, I thought Muktanat was off limits. He looked me in the eye and said, what are you doing here? I moved over to the father of the host family and resumed an earlier conversation we had had about the Tibetan saint Milarepa. He had started it when he saw me reading a biography of Milarepa. We only knew a few words in each other's language, but it was better than talking to spies from Texas. I had assumed they were spies. This is what I think they were up to. The town just up the trail is Jomsom. This is as close to Tibet as we were allowed to go. Beyond that is the Mustang district. The area was run by a warlord whom the CIA encouraged to harass communists across the border in Tibet. In exchange, they forgave his banditry. Air America was the airborne division of the CIA. The Texans were here to check on their boy. Wasn't there a scene like this in an Indiana Jones movie? The next day we hiked to Jomsom with light packs and came back to Marfa. Beyond Jomsom, the trail to the north eventually led over a pass and down into Tibet. The land surrounding Jomsom was all brown dirt and rocks. The town was nearly empty. Most people had migrated south for the winter. A stray dog meandered down the empty main street. Today there is an airport at Jomsom. From Marfa, we retraced our steps to Tatapane. Gladys was definitely warming to me. I was thinking that a brief romance with her, set against the Himalayas as a backdrop, would be very nice. The fact that Linda was coming seemed like an unrelated matter. At Tatapane, we discussed the possibility of going back to Pokhara by a different route. There was a southern route that was a little longer, but we would see some new countryside. Jim and Elsa wanted to go back the way they had come, and Gladys wanted to take the southern route with me. I took this as a good sign regarding her feelings toward me. They got Poonsak, and we got the dog. The dog presented a dilemma. We couldn't take him back to the States. We spent one night in the largest town we had seen so far. The owners of the inn there, and where we stayed, seemed wealthy, spoke English, and were somewhat westernized. Their son was away in college. This was our chance. Would you like to have a dog? They were thrilled. We were only a few days from Pokhara when we stopped on a beach by the river. We basked in the warm sun, built sand castles in the soft golden sand. Our talk drifted to more serious subjects, such as our plans for the future. Finally, we were getting somewhere, and then I blew it. I let slip that I might be getting back together with my ex-wife later in the year. From then on, Gladys never walked with me or talked to me unless it was absolutely necessary. Most of the people I had met on the hippie trail were open to casual, temporary relationships, but Gladys was no hippie. She was a socially conservative, sensible young woman from Baltimore. The last day of the trek, she took a different route to Pokhara, and I never saw her again. I felt bad. I was the only member of the trekking party on the flight back to Kathmandu. The inside of the plane looked like a school bus. This is the same DC-3. The runway was short, and the plane had to climb steeply to make it out of the valley. The stewardess chose this time to hand out the complimentary snack. The aisle was at a steep angle, and the plane was accelerating. Her progress was slow. She would lunge for the handhold on the back of a seat, drag herself to the next row, where she offered the snack, and then lunged for the next seat. The snack was hard candies in different colors and in the shapes of Hindu gods. I sucked on Ganesha as I gazed out at the Himalayas. One more note about air travel in Nepal. The country strictly prohibited anyone from taking their hashish across their borders, so they tried to catch smugglers as they boarded international flights. Instead of using a drug-sniffing dog, they used a woman's psychic. I only took a tiny bit, and I took the bus, so it wasn't a problem. Across the border in India, I got a train ticket all the way to Payyanur. It was a roundabout route, but it was more comfortable than the way I had come north. I think it must have been the tea that made me constipated. I drank cup after cup during the 5 days on the train. The train pulled into Payyanur at night. I walked to the water and climbed into the ferry. The water was perfectly still, and I could see the reflection of every star. The only sound was the regular plop of the boatman's pole. My constipation eventually ended. Until it did, I got no sympathy from the other students at the Gurukula. They all had diarrhea. Vagrant thoughts. I keep wondering how the highway and airport life in the Kali Gandaki, how the airport changed life in the highway and airport changed life in the Kali Gandaki gorge. The people would be wealthier. The tourist industry pays better than barley farming and yak herding. They must be living longer and better educated. Whether or not they are better off is up to them, not me. I don't have any pictures of my own for chapters 21 and 22, and I don't feel like sticking in a bunch of stock images. I'll think of something. And that's all.